This is Claim Your Potential, the Empowerment Podcast. I'm Sofie Lindberg, your host and the Executive Director of Claim Your Potential. Get ready to embark on a transformative journey where we empower women and girls to unlock their full potential in every aspect of life. It's time to claim your potential and step into a life of empowerment. Tune in every Tuesday as we ignite your inner strength, provide actionable insights, and empower you to achieve greatness. So, are you ready to claim your potential? Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Claim Your Potential, the Empowerment Podcast. I'm your host, Sofie, and for this episode, we are joined by Nicole Walker to explore the dynamic topic of growing your own podcast. In 2018, Nicole embarked on her podcasting journey, propelling her into the ranks of the top 50 moms in podcasting and a 2020 top influencer. Her show now stands proudly among the top 5% worldwide, achieving awards like the 2020 Best Black Business Podcast Award, also being showcased on prestigious platforms including Afros and Audios, Black Pod Festival, and Time Magazine. Beyond podcasting, Nicole is on a mission to empower women, guiding established podcasters and conferences to excel in sponsorship acquisition and more. Today, she joins us to share her invaluable insights into podcasting and its profound potential for positive change. Please welcome Nicole Walker. Thank you so much for being with us today, Nicole.
Thanks for having me, Sofie. I'm super excited to be here.
We are super excited to have you on. This is our first time, or maybe our second, but definitely we very rarely do we get a podcaster on our show. So this is super exciting for us. Podcaster to podcaster is always such a fun conversation. And I'd love to start our conversation off with hearing a little bit about your journey. When did you first realize that podcasting was the path you wanted to pursue?
Yeah, so that actually came about not by anything of my own doing, surprisingly, right? So back in 2017, I actually decided to hire a business coach. And my business coach is the person who suggested podcasting to me. Prior to that, I had not listened to a podcast, did not even know what a podcast was. And this was actually towards the end of 2017. And then fast forward to March 1st of 2018, I had launched my podcast, right? So, yeah, taking advice or a suggestion, doing some research, and voila.
I love that. And that is so interesting to me because I know that for a lot of podcasters out there, it's something that they've been wanting to do for a while and it's, always been something on their mind. So it's always interesting to hear of someone that kind of fell into it, so to speak. So that's super cool to hear. And I know that your podcast, WinHers United, what inspired you to start WinHers United?
Yeah. So when I hired my business coach, it's so funny because I actually wanted to do a scrapbooking business because I love to scrapbook, right? And this person knows me from years before. Like we were actually friends in high school. And when I told him scrapbooking, he's like, no. He's like, I see you on stages. I see you talking to women. I see you even having a focus for women of color. And then by him saying that, it actually ignited something in me because I did have the inkling, so to say, to want to do like motivational conversations, mindset conversations, leadership development conversations, right? So if I could be honest, I would say that it actually started happening before I realized it was happening. So when I was in grad school for my master's, I took a class called leadership. And that leadership class literally chewed me up, spit me out. It just really spit me around, right? Because it helped me to realize that the leader I thought I was being was not the leader that was necessarily showing up every day, all day. And once I found this information, I actually had this desire to want to help other people understand that information. But it's not like it was something that I was actively, going after, but it was like deep down inside. So, in having that conversation with my business coach and him actually saying, I see you doing this, that, and the third, it was kind of that permission that I needed to allow myself to not want to hide and actually stand in the front and give people that information. And then also another caveat to that was that I actually had aspirations of being an entrepreneur. I had done some entrepreneurial things in the past, but I hadn't really taken myself seriously. So I wanted to take myself seriously this time around. So for me, deciding to interview women of color entrepreneurs was a way for me to hone my skills as an entrepreneur and learn some of the secret sauce from all of these amazing women, and then use that for myself, but also give it back to the world.
Oh my goodness, I love that, and I'm connecting to what you're saying in the sense that, that taking away of knowledge from all these conversations that you're having. I think that's something that I definitely feel speaking with so many women on Claim Your Potential. Every episode I'm walking away with a new piece of wisdom or a new practice to employ or a new idea about a different sector that I might not be exposed to all the time. So I definitely understand what you mean by just being around all that knowledge and the joy of talking to so many different people and really just like a sponge absorbing it all. So definitely relating to that. In terms of starting your podcast and growing your podcast, and perhaps this is just me trying to pick your brain a bit here, but what were some of those strategies that you found were helpful in really growing your podcast and achieving such recognition?
Yeah, so I would definitely say for me, education is key, right? So I actually moved, right? So that was actually part of my beginning story too. I used to live in New Jersey, born and raised, and I moved down to Florida right before I started my podcast. And then moving to Florida, I learned that it was a big podcasting community out here. So after learning that, I would go to different workshops. They would have meetups, like monthly meetups, and I would go there and I would learn different things. I would go to conferences and learn different things there, right? So that honed in on me learning the information, actually growing, right? Because when you get to network and meet with people, you introduce yourself, and hopefully you're also saying that, hey, I have a podcast, right? So that is allowing you to grow listeners. There are also strategies as far as like social media. I think social media is a great tool to use to grow your podcast, right? And that could look like anything from joining different groups. I know Facebook as well as LinkedIn, they're great as far as having those groups and utilizing those groups to introduce yourself as a podcaster, to introduce yourself as a subject matter expert, and possibly gain a following from that. And then I'd also say like TikTok as well as IG, those are very good for, utilizing those hashtags and allowing yourself to be found in those ways, right? Another way that you can grow your podcast that I'm not sure a lot of people really understand is it's more, I feel like I want to say lucrative, but it's a smart decision, right? To actually be a guest on other people's podcasts. Because if you think platform to platform, like, yeah, it's super cool to tell all your social media friends that you have a podcast, but getting a person to leave their social media platform to go over to listen to a podcast may not be as successful as talking about your podcast on another podcast because you're already talking to podcast listeners, right? So getting them to actually add another podcast into their rotation is a higher probability of that. So that's a great resource to use to grow your podcast as well.
Yeah, that last point there is definitely something that I really undervalued when I started podcasting. I promoted it to Instagram and Facebook and LinkedIn and that was our growth strategy for a while. And then I went on someone's podcast just because I was in the mood. I was feeling like, I kind of want to talk to someone today. So I went on someone's podcast and as soon as that had released, we had such a spike in listeners. We had a spike in followers on our different social media accounts. And so it was from then that I realized that that is such an effective method that I feel like a lot of people really undervalue and really underutilize is being on other people's podcasts. Because as you said, you're already connected on that platform that you want people to go to. It's a podcast to a podcast rather than, as you said, hopping from a completely different app or website or whatever to a different form of consuming your information. So, for sure, I definitely, to all of our listeners out there, that's such a great strategy to employ if you're starting your podcast and you're struggling to grow. reach out to some people. There's plenty of sites as well that you can go to that are free to use that you can find shows that are looking for guests. So absolutely there. And
I do want to plug another like high level
yeah.
tip. Yeah. So another thing, like, once you do that and you get yourself out there on social media and you go on other people's podcasts, right? Like you begin to grow these relationships and nurture these relationships, right? So another hack is to connect with those other podcasters, grow those relationships, and then you all can possibly do promo swaps, right? So let's say you swap promotions on each other's social media platforms because this other person has a podcast. They may have an engaged audience, right? If you do some research into the statistics of podcasting, because podcasting is such a personal platform, the listeners of podcasts actually really trust the host that they're listening to. So a lot of times if a host says this is a great product to buy or a great podcast to listen to, their listeners are more likely to do that, right? So you can swap promotions on social media with different podcasters. You can choose to run ads on each other's podcasts and swap that. Or another amazing thing is like if you all actually decide to swap episodes. So you work with a podcast that, of course, is like in the same realm as yours. You guys have the same target audience, and you actually decide to swap out episodes for each other. That is a great way to increase those listeners.
Yeah, and speaking of ads, I know that part of what you do as a growth strategist is you assist podcasters in securing those sponsorships and generating revenue. And so, going into that ad conversation, what are some effective approaches for podcast monetization that you recommend to fellow podcasters?
Yeah, so I like to tell people because I think a lot of people, because there's such a low barrier of entry into podcasting, a lot of people want to become podcasters and they want it to instantly be successful and instantly give them all of this money, right? And I like to tell people that a lot of times podcasting is a long game, right? And a lot of times podcasting is a funnel. And when I say it's a funnel, it's usually a way to get people into your orbit to possibly sell to them other things, right? So, some ways to make money in podcasting could be to create a membership group, right? And the people that are listeners to your podcast can then become members of your group. Another way is if you have products that you sell, advertising those products on your podcast as your call to action for your listeners. Hey, if you love this episode about how to bake a cake, then purchase my ebook about how to bake a cake. I go really in depth, more than I did on this episode, about how to bake a cake in my ebook, right? Another thing that podcasting is great for is to get you speaking engagements, right? So it's a great platform to launch you in that direction, as well as coaching, as well as consulting, right? So basically showing yourself as a subject matter expert and getting yourself out there in relation to that. Now, as far as getting advertisers or advertisements on your podcast, I would say what I tell my clients is the first thing I like to do is to start with your podcast data. Like what does that data look like? And actually, I take it a step further than podcast data, right? Because the way the podcasting world is set up, unless you have thousands and thousands of downloads per episode, you traditionally, the way it's set up, you're not going to make a huge amount of money, right? But people often fail to take into consideration their entire ecosystem, right? So, you may not have thousands and thousands of downloads per episode, but you have a loyal following for your podcast. You have a decent following on your social media. You have a decent email marketing campaign going with a decent amount of subscribers. Your website gets a decent amount of hits per month. Every quarter, biannually, or annually, you host an event. Those are all outlets that you could put together and create packages to offer to a potential sponsor, right? So I tell people to look at your entire ecosystem and put that together as a package, as opposed to just looking at your podcast, right? So yeah, looking at that data, also creating a media kit, right? So that's something that I help people with as well. It's like, okay, you have all of this amazing things going on. How are you showcasing that in bite-sized chunks, so that a person can look, understand, and make a decision, right? So creating that media kit, having it polished and professional to the point, and giving people the information they need to decide if they want to do business with you. Then you have to decide what companies you want to work with. What companies actually want to get in front of your listeners? Who are your listeners? So taking the time to understand who's my audience and what makes my audience valuable. Then what other companies also value my audience so that I can position myself to show that my podcast, my social media, my website, my email list, my events is a viable option for this individual company. Right. Then you take it a step further. And once you decide those companies, you actually have to figure out who's the go to people in those companies, who's in the marketing department, who's in the partnerships department, who's in the growth department. And a strategy that I use is not to just reach out to the administrative assistant, right? Because they're not the person that makes the decisions, but to actually reach out to management, to reach out to CMOs if the company's not that large, right? But to reach out to those people that can actually decide to spend the dollars that you're looking for them to spend, right? And then there's, investigation into finding that person's email address. And then once you find that, having a persuasive pitch email that you send out to these companies. And one of the number one keys that I think a lot of people get hung up on is that the fortune is in the follow up, right? Like a lot of people, may send one email or make one phone call or send one DM and feel like, oh, this person doesn't like me. Oh, my podcast is not good enough, or my brand is not good enough. But no, oftentimes you have to reach out and continue to reach out. And I'm not talking every day, 5 times a day, right? Because it gets weird then, right? But, a decent schedule of reaching out and reminding that person, hey, don't forget, I have this opportunity for you. And also realizing that it's an opportunity for that company. Not that you're going begging for anything, but you have an opportunity for them to get in front of your loyal listeners, fan base, followers, whatever you want to call them, right? Understanding that you have an opportunity for them and reaching out and continuing to reach out until you get a yes or until you get a no.
Right, it falls under that umbrella of it never hurts to ask, and that's something that I think a lot of podcasters, especially women, struggle with, is I feel like women, we never really wanna ask for help, and this is just something that I'm trying to work on, and I see so many other women struggle with it, but we usually don't wanna ask for help, and the thought of reaching out to someone that we've never spoken to before in our life, that we have no connection with whatsoever, and to ask for help, to ask for money essentially, I think is such a scary feeling, or just even thinking about it right now is making my heart palpitate and my hands sweat. So it's definitely something I think a lot of us are scared of. But again, as you said, it never hurts to ask because we don't know, and
Right.
there's so many people in this world. There's so many companies in this world that does it really matter if you get 100 no's? Because at some point you're gonna get a yes.
And you know what? You just made me think of two different things, right? So the first thing you made me think of is something that I also have to remind myself of. I guess it's a quote. I forget where I probably learned it from someone on my podcast. And it was, the answer is always no until you ask or unless you ask, right? Like the answer is always no if you never make the ask, right? So you have your initial no because you're not reaching out to see if it's anything other than a no, right? And then the other thing that actually a teenpreneur, right? She's so amazing. Oh my goodness. She started her business, I think, when she was like 7 years old. And like she's just reaching such amazing heights in her business. She said to her, no is not no. No just means not now or not right now, right? So oftentimes, even if you get a no, that doesn't mean reaching out to this person next year, 6 months from now, or whatever, to see if anything changed with the decision that they made at that previous time.
Yes. Oh my goodness, yes. I could not agree more with that. I think that's such a great way to think about it. And props to her because that's definitely what I've seen in the times that I have reached out and I've gotten a no back. Maybe a couple months later I'll reach out again and I'll check in and say, "Hey, it's been a while since we've spoken. Last time we talked, I asked if you wanted to get involved with this. Just wanted to check in to see if this is still something that might interest you." And usually I will get a yes back, or I'll get a, you know what, send me another email in 2 months and we'll talk then. But at least again, it's not a no, that's the end of discussion. It's a no for right now. So I definitely love that there. I think that is such a great way to think about it. I know I definitely need to go into some of my sponsorship conversations more like that and less of, oh, they said no. All right, moving on to the next person. So, absolutely there. And I want to take a moment to kind of talk about the content aspect of podcasting. I think a lot of newer podcasters, and I know I've definitely struggled with this as well, is trying to figure out how do you create engaging and valuable content that can grow your podcast. So, are you able to share your process for brainstorming, planning, and delivering episodes that really resonate with your audience and get that engagement?
Yeah, so something that I give in one of my talks, so and it actually comes from data. If you're already a podcaster, is to take time and dig into your data, right? So dig into what episodes of your podcast are most popular because that's your audience telling you what they like the most, right? And once you do that, if you want to pull and actually decide to give them more episodes that lend themselves to the episodes that are more popular, that's a way that you're directly giving your listeners what they have shown you that they want to listen to by way of numbers, right? So for me, and what I do in podcasting, it's a little tricky, right? Because I interview women of color entrepreneurs, similar to what you're doing right now, Sofie interviewing me, right? So it's like, okay, but we talk about, for us, it's, a little different, right? Like we talk about more mindset stuff and leadership stuff, right? So it's like that per se may not be able to tell me what they want to listen to. It may more likely be based on the popularity of my guests. But if your topics range and vary based on whatever your overarching message is, then that's a great way to determine. Another way is to actually create a survey and find out from your listeners what do they want to hear. Ask people to jump in your DMs, like ask the people to tell you what they want from you, right? That's a great way for you to do that. And then I would also say utilizing SEO options, right? So there's a website that you can search different keywords, right? So, whatever your topic is, let's say it's business, right? Like you search business, and then you can find out the kind of questions that people are asking Google or all of those search engines about business, right? So then, and it gives you a long list, right? So utilizing that data, that gives you exactly what's most popular in the world, and you can streamline and pull out different pieces from that and create episodes that directly attribute themselves to the questions that individuals are typing into the search engines, right? I would say also paying attention to the trends that are happening in your industry, right? Like if there are emerging topics or emerging trends within the industry, then it's in your best interest to pull in those topics and talk about them on your podcast. And those are a few things that come to my mind off the top. And I'm so bummed I can't think of that website. I'm going to try to think of it for you.
Yeah, I'll definitely look into it on my end as well because I think that's something that would be great for claim your potential, and definitely something that we've struggled with in creating content is really figuring out what our listeners want to hear. And so for us, it's just been a lot of trial and error, and we're still trialing and erroring, so to speak.
Right.
So it's definitely, a lot of it comes down to don't be afraid to try new things. Don't be afraid to, get out of your comfort zone a little bit. And so, maybe throwing out an episode that you haven't done before that's not at all, still fitting in your theme, of course, but not like any of the other episodes that you've done yet. So, definitely trial and error is so important and just actually quite a fun process. It might
Right.
not be fun when you look at the stats, but it's fun actually recording new episodes and just seeing where you can go with it.
Right. And if you don't do those things, how will you know what
Yeah.
works or what doesn't work? Right. So I think it's such a valuable tool. A lot of people look at things as failure, but failure, quote unquote, because I don't like to use that word, it teaches you lessons. Right. So to me, learning a lesson is a major win. And I actually did remember the website. It's called answerthepublic.com.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, I'm going to go look at that right after this because I would love to know what people are asking, especially when it comes to women's empowerment, because we have our financial empowerment. academic, emotional, and professional empowerment pillars that claim your potential. So I'm always curious to see, what the questions are in each area. So that's fascinating. And to really connect everything together, what is one thing that our listeners should take away from this episode?
Yeah, so I feel like what popped in my mind as I was listening to some of the things that we were talking about and that you were saying in response is that in relation to podcasting, persistence is key and consistency is key. And that's actually something that I forgot to say, which a lot of people underestimate in relation to growing your podcast, right? Like really being consistent, creating a schedule, sticking to the schedule, telling your listeners when they can expect you, when not to expect you, and things like that. Like that is an amazing way to grow your podcast, right? So, and that it ties into, reaching out to sponsors and all of those things, right? So I would say consistency is key, and being persistent is the way that you grow your podcast and be around for the long run in relation to podcasting.
Yeah, persistency and being consistent for sure. Definitely two pieces I've noticed. My family, my friends will tell you that it doesn't matter what's going on in my life, rain or shine. I will always publish a new episode right on schedule because of that consistency. You don't want to let listeners down. You don't want them to be waiting and following your show and waiting for those new episode reminders only for it not to come out. And then same thing with that just being persistent, right? Because it takes a while to get growth on a podcast. And, your first few episodes, even for us, our first 20 episodes, we did not see the type of traction that we wanted to see. And so I was very close to giving up and saying, you know what, let me cut my losses. I don't want to deal with this anymore. But I decided to keep going. And then now I'm starting to see some of that response from people. So for sure, just be persistent and be consistent. I love that. And for all of our listeners that don't want to stop hearing your amazing wisdom, how can they connect with you?
Yeah. So if you want to learn more about me and WinHers United in relation to my podcast, you can go to winhersunited.com, and that's WinhersUnited.com, right? If you're looking for help in relation to creating a media kit, analyzing your podcast data, or getting sponsorship for your podcast or events, you can go to winhersunited.com/book a call. And if you want to follow me on social media, I'm at WinHers United. And I also have links to my social media on my website.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for coming onto the podcast, Nicole. It's been an absolute pleasure. And I am going to be sending this episode to our podcast team as soon as it is released so that they can take some of the notes that you've talked about so that we can apply it to our own podcast and hopefully grow on our end as well. So thank you so much for coming on to the podcast, Nicole.
I love that. It was awesome to be here. Thanks for having me.
That brings us to the end of another empowering episode on Claim Your Potential, the Empowerment Podcast. Thanks for listening. If you've enjoyed our show and want to learn more about the work we do, you can visit our website, claimyourpotential.org. There, you can access our tools and workbooks, sign up for workshops, join our mentorship program, listen to previous and future episodes, donate to support our cause, and find out how you can get involved. For even more inspiring content, follow us on Instagram and Facebook at Claim Potential, where we share inspiration, educational resources, episode and program announcements, and other content designed to help you reach your full potential. Your support means the world to us, and a free way to support our show is by leaving a rating and review on the podcast streaming platform of your choice. Your feedback helps us grow and reach even more people with our empowering message. If you're unsure of how to do this, head over to our website's Leave a Review page for step-by-step instructions. Thank you to each and every one of you for being a part of this empowering community. Tune in next time as we continue our journey of learning and discover even more ways to claim your potential. Until then, remember that you have the power to create the life you desire. Keep striving and keep growing.